too long didn't watch. I built an Athlon PC and my excitement uploaded the entire thing onto YouTube. Throughout the video I learned a lot of things such as voltages, motherboard issues, and temperature concerns. It does well for entry-level gaming for $300 and does decently well on synthetic benchmarks. These are the components I use, though you can go cheaper. Pause if you want to check the parts out. The Athlon 3000G. Ever since the virus began, for some reason I began to hyperfixate on computer electronics and never let go. Some fade into nonchalance and I eventually forget, and some of the weirder ones never leave my mind. It boggles me how varied computer components can get despite having been only an enthusiast about it a few months back. I've only built a PC like twice, once with the help of my friend and it's a used PC from my younger sister, the other was just me replacing a case. In hindsight, now trying to build my third PC just to prove a point might be a waste of money, but well, you only live once. This PC only lives once. What's the point, you might ask? I'm going to build a cheap computer that still can game. I'm going to call this project the Athlon Miracle, since this cheap processor is a miracle for a lot of budget players and myself. I've been hooked to PC building and tech related videos these past few months and came across someone doing that kind of shit. And I started watching his videos when one recommended video stuck out. His video gave me my first introduction to the Athlon 3000G. I was fascinated. This right here was a low-end PC part. For just $50, you get 2 cores, 4 threads, and a whole bunch of Zen. An architecture from over 4 years ago. Frankly, getting the package through my door is already giving me Zen. While the first time I met this unusual processor did not furrow my eyebrows, I get more and more recommendations from, you guessed it, LowSpecGamer, and a few others like Random Gaming in HD, and a few other YouTube channels like CrystalDiskMark. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name right. Botched naming aside, these YouTube channels did things like overclocking videos, ray tracing on an Athlon APU, demanding AAA games on an Athlon, 30 games on an Athlon 3000G and the Vega iGPU. I was hooked. Also, if you want to check out the channels in the videos, I'll link them all in the description. Seriously, thanks all of you. Another part of the story, a lot of my friends have crappy PCs. We're talking I could go to primary school old. One of my friends had a Core 2 Quad. Another had a Turion 2 Neo. A processor from 2010 in their laptop. They got the laptop for $15. It's amazing, to say the least. Either it was a laptop or a desktop that was passed down. All of it share one thing in common. They can't do any daily things, let alone play games. There's no sort of hate against used PC components or laptop parts, especially when they are still usable. It actually saves the environment that way. But when these laptops and PC components are barely usable for anything other than daily moderate typing of a Word document, things start to go wrong really quickly. I didn't like that. And it doesn't help that one of my younger sister's all-in-one PCs, which has an i3 6100T, a dual core that can barely do anything until I install a second stick of RAM, is better than all of the other PCs I've heard of. I tried playing games on it. The experience was unlike anything I've seen. I'm being sarcastic. Let's say all low 600p Genshin Impact was the icing on the cake. Tickle my noggin to see how people get along with gamings on things that don't qualify as gaming. They really deserve better. That and my dad wanted a cheap PC that lasts for a really long time. While trying to find a way to help them to make their PCs better, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be fantastic if there was a PC that could play modern popular games at a decent frame rate that doesn't cost more than they want to spend? And that's where the Athlon 3000G came in. Of course, the YouTubers mentioned above already built one, but god damn it, I want to try one myself! So Dad, my friends, this video is for you. In this video, I'm gonna show you what parts I used to build this PC, their prices, then I'm gonna overclock this PC. I'm also going to show some real-time games, benchmarks, and some editing work. My aim is a cheap PC, but I splurged a little on the parts because I wanted to do other stuff on it. You can go cheaper. Oh yeah, because this is my first time, benchmarks are limited. Give suggestions in the comments down below. Thanks! Of course, no PC is complete without the star of the show, the central processing unit, or known as the CPU. For those who searched earlier or are fanatic tech video watchers like me, you know about the CPU. It's a 2-core, 4-threaded, Zen architecture CPU with 32 x 2 KB of L1 cache, 512 x 2 KB of L2 cache, and 4 MB of shared L3 cache. Fabricated on the 14nm Global Foundries process, it boasts up to 3.5 GHz per core. Its integrated GPU is a 3-core Vega, clocked at up to 1.1 GHz. It has a TDP of 35 watts and was released in 2019. What's so special about this processor is the fact that it can overclock thanks to a bug with its predecessor, the Athlon 200GE. And to squeeze every bit of performance out of this small piece of awesomeness, I'll do exactly that. Thanks to the high demand and the virus as well as supply issues, this tiny little processor went for hire. In here it costs about $120 US, shipping included. Base price in America is about $90 US. This is because my country doesn't sell Athlons because it's in such low demand. However, in other countries, the prices might be different, so if you find a corresponding processor or a better one for the same price, go for it. To complement that, the motherboard is a B450M DS3H from Gigabyte. This I got for $97 US in my tech mall, and on Newegg it was listed as $90 US. There was a certain BioStar B450MH that went for really cheap, somewhere around in the ballpark of $70 US, but I did not want to risk it. Oh yeah, there's something I wish to mention just as I edited this video. After doing so, I had some cooling issues and I checked online after searching. Gamers Nexus had a video about overclocking and they discovered my VRM temperatures were dangerously close to 105 degrees Celsius. For processors better than the Athlon 3000G, and if you plan to overclock it, buy a better motherboard in case you do want to end up getting that. The BioStar B450MH is not going to be a good sort considering that I checked it out and it doesn't have a heatsink on its VRMs. It's going to start smelling like burnt plastic sooner or later. And you don't want to spend $70 US for a PC that lasts for only 2 months and 3, and then you have to get an entire new motherboard, reassemble the entire thing, and waste more of your time. I didn't choose an A series motherboard despite it being cheaper because only the B series and above supports overclocking. If you do not want to overclock, an A series is the better option. I do want to overclock the CPU, so I'm going for the B option. Next up, we have the RAM. Because I was in such an absolute hurry and didn't want shipping fees, I went with a Corsair Vengeance RGB 8x2GB of RAM at 3600 mega transfers, costing $135 US. This was a mistake. While Athlons support high transfer rates, the performance improvement for gaming diminishes very quickly. After I found this out, I switched to RAM sticks with my current workstation build. So now this PC runs the Patriot Viper Elite DDR4 2133. This kit goes for $80 US last I checked on Newegg, but you can get away with 8GB of RAM and cheaper sticks. A quick search on Newegg shows one with $60 US. Just be warned that cheaper sticks of RAM means lower overclocking headroom. To power this entire system, I went with a Thermaltake Light Power 450 watt. This is a dangerous power supply, but heck, we're just powering a single motherboard, a CPU, a few sticks of RAM, and that's all there is to it. This went for $38 US. Now, I originally planned to build this without a case, but I scavenged an old case from my old PC. I don't even know what case this is. There's not even a single model number on it. But, well, it works. If you're going no case, grab a button and wire it up. You do need to be careful about it and require some DIY know-how. Finally, for a hard disk drive, I went with a Transcend 128GB SSD230S. This is a SATA 3 SSD with a DRAM cache. This cost me roughly $30 US. This is the absolute bare minimum. Feel free to add a hard disk or something that contains more memory, in case you want to store games, such as Modern Warfare type games. In total, this entire build costs $420 US for me, including shipping. This PC goes for $308.52 minus shipping and tax, however. It's a very dirt cheap PC, and you can upgrade it very easily. Earlier on, I claimed to have found inner zen once I got the parcel, so I opened it up and the first thing I did with the CPU was build it. And after waiting for so long and being impatient, this was the result. Alright, now with the PC built, the next thing I'm gonna talk about is how I overclocked it, and after that I'm going to be testing some games. It's experiment time. Get your safety goggles. Quick disclaimer, remember that overclocking carries risk, and damage done by overclocking is not covered in any warranty whatsoever. Tread this area carefully. I am not an experienced overclocker, nor do I know everything about overclocking. However, if you want to squeeze every bit of performance from this PC, overclocking is your best shot. As long as you don't do anything stupid, your PC and you should be fine. Also, in case if you do not have the same PC components as I do, be sure to find overclocking guides for that particular component. That or experiment yourself. Alright, before beginning to overclock, go to your motherboard manufacturer's website, grab the latest copy of the BIOS, and then flash it. For those with newer motherboards, accessing the BIOS is simple. Simply hold Shift and click on the Restart button, then click on Troubleshoot, then Advanced Options, then UEFI Firmware Settings. This will restart the PC and then boot up to the BIOS the next time. Alternatively, you could spam whatever key that activates the BIOS. For me, it was Delete. That also works. I did mention before that the Athlon 3000G overclocks well. It overclocks a bit too well. Originally, the base clocks were 3.5 GHz on the CPU and 1.1 GHz on the integrated graphics. In the BIOS, I set the settings to 3.9 GHz on the CPU with a voltage of 1.3 volts. The integrated graphics has a 1.65 GHz clock now with a voltage of 1.175 volts. Because of a few other YouTube videos from Gamers Nexus, it became apparent that touching the socket on chip overflow is not a good idea, especially on a Gigabyte motherboard. Originally, I set this as 1.2 volts, then 1.15 volts, but now I turned it off. It did not affect stability in any way. I also overclocked the RAM up to 2933 megatransfers, with the timings 16, 18, 18, 36 with 1.4 volts. These are uncomfortable voltages, but these does set the RAM stable. If you do not need such high speeds, you can always clock it down. Back to default settings. In general, there are two schools of thought when overclocking. Overclocking safely for a slightly better experience for daily use, or overclocking to the limit to maximize performance at the cost of life. In this use case, the aim is to squeeze a decent amount of performance while balancing other aspects, such as temperatures, voltage, and life expectancy. Me from a few days ago did not know this and ended up wasting money on a bigger cooler. You can still get away with a stock cooler, especially while overclocking. To test the stability of the system as well as the temperatures, I ran Prime95 with smallest FFTs checked and Furmark simultaneously. This tests both the CPU and integrated graphics at the same time, as well as the memory. Also, I measured temperatures with hardware info. Take note because hardware info might be off base sometimes. If you really want to do some crazy overclocking, be sure to get some hardware that detects temperatures and voltage. One important thing I found out about overclocking is that the motherboard matters too. Earlier I talked about how hot VRM temperatures can get when overclocking. To demonstrate, I shall use clock speeds that I retrieved from LowSpecGamer's overclocking video. The voltages I experimented myself to ensure stability. The CPU has a clock speed of 4 GHz with a voltage of 1.35 volts. The integrated graphics now has 1.7 GHz with 1.3 volts. As for the socket on chip, it receives 1.2625 volts. I switched the RAM to the Corsair Vengeance RGB and set it at 3400 megatransfers at 1.35 volts. The entire PC was running very hot. I was surprised when overclocked RAM also affected the processor's power draw as well as the temperatures on the MOSFET. Socket temperatures were reaching 93 degrees Celsius, with the VRMs reaching 65 degrees Celsius. The processor sipped up a total of 87.6 watts at peak. I genuinely say this was the reason why I got that oversized cooler, funnily enough. Using the previous setup and previous voltages as well as the Patriot Elite RAM, I ran the same test and received socket temperatures of 83 degrees Celsius at peak with VRMs on 61 degrees Celsius. The processor used a maximum of 70 watts, very close to the box cooler's dissipation capacity. It is possible to overclock without the need for an extra aftermarket cooler. It's also possible to get a new case with better airflow for the components, but at this price range, and considering how much overclocking we did, you barely get any improvements. Running the Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmarks yielded no gain, with only a 0.3 frame difference. In fact, the stutters in the max overclock PC made the game unplayable and tanks this frame rate. This is run on low-medium settings with LowSpecGamer's clever edits. The overclocked memory fared no better. It has a performance improvement of just 0.2 frames. For a tiny frame difference but higher heat and power draw, less is more. Hence, it is best to take note of the temperatures and to undervolt whenever possible. This will help save the components and make them last longer. To test this PC, I have gathered multiple games with different graphics libraries and all walks of life to perform a well-rounded test for those who wish to build this PC. For instance, DirectX 12 and Vulkan benefits AMD more since the Vega 3i GPU has a hardware scheduler, while DirectX 11 tosses the draw calls in one thread, meaning in DX11, the Athlon 3000G might become a bottleneck. OpenGL is very widely used, albeit with their issues. I do not know much about these, but the important point is that each graphics library possesses their own intricacies. All games are tested with no VSync on to prevent frame caps limiting the PC's potential. Multiple metrics will also be measured, particularly minimum, maximum, and average frame rates, 1% and 0.1%, frame times and frame time stability, power draw, and CPU and GPU usage. This information is logged through MSI Afterburner and Riva Tuner. The footage is captured by an Elgato HD 60S capture card for zero performance loss. Minimum, maximum, and average frame rates are reported via average. 1% and 0.1% frame rates are measured by their lowest number. Frame times will be shown and stability is calculated by stutters against time. A stutter is counted as at least 50% more than the previously recorded frame time for games targeted at 60 frames per second, half of that for 30 frames per second. If the game has a benchmark, that will be used. If it does not, I will detail how I benchmark the game that stresses the PC. All graphics settings are also stated and shown on screen before the benchmark results are given. I will also state how many times I ran each benchmark. These are the game benchmarks. I had help from my friend to videotape League of Legends material. Thank you. I have chosen 4 high-end titles, 2 mid-range titles, 5 competitive titles, and Minecraft since it's widely popular and can be used as a use case scenario. These are the synthetic benchmarks. 3 are from 3DMark for overall stress testing. Cinebench and Geekbench stresses and measures the CPU respectively. CrystalDiskMark checks the speed of the storage, and LatencyMon makes sure there are no stutters on idle. The demo of PCMark 10 rounds up the benchmarks rush. Finally, to make sure the overclocking system is stable, I ran a 1-hour Furmark and Prime95 stress test and recorded information for longevity approximation. Recording is done with hardware info. A caution, I benchmarked this PC with an aftermarket cooler. If you have the stock cooler, temperatures might be different and higher. If there is anything that can be improved, feel free to criticize in the comments. Again, I am in no way a proper overclocker nor a professional. I'm just a no-lifer at home, so criticism is appreciated, so long as it's said in a tactful manner. Refer to the timestamps below to time travel to a specific one. I tested Red Dead Redemption 2 with a benchmark at 720p at 7/8 the resolution scale with these settings. I also used LowSpecGamer's special tweaks in the configuration file. The benchmark consists of multiple different scenes, all testing particle effects, lighting, shadow, large numbers of textures, level of detail, as well as a realistic scene with what a player might do. I used Vulkan as the graphics library here. The game hit an average FPS of 31.7. It has a minimum FPS of 23.2 and a maximum FPS of 38. There is a 1% low of 24 FPS and a 0.1% low of 4 FPS. In the realistic gameplay benchmark, there were 5 spikes in 2 minutes, hence a frame time stability of 2.5 spikes per minute. Ignore the high bumps at the beginning of the level, as that is mainly loading the level. The power usage danced around 50 watts of power and average temperatures sat staunchly at 52 degrees Celsius. The game is pure GPU bottleneck. It is always at 100%, while the CPU usage danced around up to a maximum of 95% at times. Aside from the occasional stutter, this game is an enjoyable console experience, and I would play this game even at the settings. Next, I used the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark at 720p, SMAA, exclusive full screen with these settings. The benchmark tests for AI, lighting, shadows, reflections, and distance LOD. The graphics engine can be configured to use DX11, but I used DX12. I ran this benchmark once since I thought the benchmark would give an accurate result after one run. The game reported an average of 26 FPS. It has a minimum FPS of 20 and a maximum of 55. The maximum was recorded during the first part of the third test. There is a 1% low of 19 and a 0.1% of 16. Except for the first part of the third benchmark, an extreme outlier, frame times are very stable with no spikes happening. Average temperatures were at 52 degrees Celsius and power usage is at 50 watts. The game is entirely GPU bound, as you tell with other games on this list. Despite the slightly bumped up settings, the processor handled it like a champ, a playable experience. Grand Theft Auto 5, an oldie but goodie. I tried it at 900p all low to medium settings, with 5/6 render scale so at 750p. The benchmark tests for lighting in different conditions, particles, texture loading, LOD, and has a realistic gameplay for what a player might do. I ran this benchmark only once. There is an average of 74.78 FPS for all 5 runs, minimum FPS of 44.4, and a maximum FPS of 94.6. There is a 1% low of 45.5 and a 0.1% low of 14. I forgot to record this game with MSI Afterburner, pardon me, so I do not have any frame time measurements. However, this game is very playable and can definitely do much more. I reckon turning off the render scale might yield much more beautiful scenery but still hit 60 FPS. Because I didn't think this through, I tried running Cyberpunk 2077, 720p at 75% resolution scaling, so 540p with these settings. Since it has no benchmark, I decided to start the game by going through the prologue of the corpo section of the game with these settings. Because of this, I ran this title only once. I assume this will test lighting, large loading of cities, as well as AI. This game is mainly DX12. What surprised me was how well this game ran. MSI Afterburner reported an average of 30 FPS. There is a minimum of 20 FPS and a maximum of 40 FPS. There was a 19 FPS 1% low and a 0.1% low of 6 FPS. There were 6 spikes in total in these 4 minutes for a result of 1.5 spikes per minute. This game is very GPU bound, but it did stress the CPU too. Usages were at 100% and up to 90% respectively. The game uses up to 50 watts of power at peak. With new updates, this game might perform better, but for now, this runs barely manageably. The fact this game runs at all is beyond me. Genshin Impact is tested with 3 separate tests. 900p, forced full screen with low medium settings. If you want to play the game at full screen in lower resolutions, hold Alt then press enter. Now these tests, I do not know if these are the best, but they will do. First I teleported to the Statue of the Seven in Dihua Marsh at 6 AM, then jogged to Wang Shu Inn, took the lift and set in, and stood at the balcony beside the teleport waypoint while facing Dragonspine. This tests large quantities of shadows with grass and large numbers of textures, with slight sprinkles of AI. Next, I teleported to Mondstadt and stood at the Hands of Barbados statue at 12 PM, then ran around the city, going to Hertha, then going to Angel's Share, then to Wagner's, through the alleys, and then back to the Favonius HQ. Finally, I teleported to Ridgewatch and started a battle. This battle has a lot going on, and with the right characters, it definitely can stress the Athlon. My team comprises of Ningguang, Beidou, Noel, and Diona. Diona's burst also tests particle effects on Genshin. These are the results. Take note that Genshin forces a 60 FPS cap even without V-Sync. Remember earlier I said that DX11 might hit harder on the CPU? This is one of the games that ended up doing that. On the Wang Shu Inn run, there is an FPS of 58 average, with a minimum of 41 and a maximum of 61, with 1% lows at 27 FPS and 0.1% lows at 5 FPS. The 2.5 minute run had a total of 10 spikes, which gives it a 4 spike per minute measurement. GPU usage hit 100% at peak, and in this benchmark, this is the first time the CPU also hit 100% at peak. The CPU is reportedly using 49 watts of power and has an average temperature of 55 degrees Celsius. On the Mondstadt city run, the average FPS was 60, with a minimum and maximum of 50 and 61 respectively, 1% low at 35 FPS and 0.1% low at 7 FPS. There's more spikes here than the service end of a mace, with a total of 19 spikes in 3 minutes. This is a measurement of 6.3 spikes per minute. Processor usage was, however, decent at 80 to 90% on both the CPU and GPU. Temperatures averaged at about 53 degrees Celsius with a 45 watt power draw, owing to less processing needed. This might be RAM issues. With faster RAM, I assume this might have less spikes. Finally, on the Ridgewatch battle run, the average FPS was 55 with a minimum and maximum of 38 and 62 respectively. There's a 1% low of 36 FPS and a 0.1% low of 9. There is a total of 8 spikes within this 2-minute run for a 4 spike per minute result. Due to the large number of effects, this part is very GPU bound and is stuck at 100%. The processor sipped up an average of 45 watts, sometimes spiking to 53 watts. Temperatures staunchly remained at 51 degrees Celsius. The spikes I might not find an issue, but there are so many frame time spikes that I wonder if anyone would want to play it. Ace Combat 7, a DX11 game, is tested at 720p, all low, but 100% render scale, with these settings. Despite being an underrated game, it does have some deceptively large requirements. I mean, the game got clouds, and clouds are a graphics card's worst enemy. That and smoke. I tested the game by playing through Mission 13, Bunker Buster, once. Mission 13 uses a large amount of clouds and can sufficiently stress the Vega 3 integrated processor. It's also a fairly fast mission. The game yielded an average frame rate of 44 with a minimum and maximum of 29 and 62 respectively. There is a 1% low of 32 and a 0.1% low of 26. There were 8 frame time spikes in the 8 minutes and 33 seconds this game ran for a 0.94 spike per minute result. Never has the CPU reached above 70%, but the poor Vega 3 is constantly at 100%. It didn't catch a break. The processor temperature was recorded at 54 degrees Celsius and sipped up 52 watts, up to 55 watts at peak. An enjoyable experience in this game, but it might not fit the task for some people well. You can always reduce the settings if needed. Definitely would play this game in a heartbeat on this PC. Very playable. Overwatch is tested at 900p 75% resolution scale, so 720p with these settings. I benchmarked this by running through the training grounds, then with an easy bot match in Hollywood with May. There really was no consensus on how to test this game apart from general stability and use case scenarios. I tested this once each. For those that might want to play competitively, rejoice! The average frame rate for the training ground run is 69, nice, with a minimum of 62 and a maximum of 72. There is a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 14. There is a single frame time spike in the 48 seconds of training grounds running, meaning a 1.25 spike per minute measurement. In a heavier firefight, such as in the case of Hollywood Capture and Escort, the average frame rate hit 67 with a minimum of 45 and a maximum of 72. There is a 1% low of 50 and a 0.1% low of 20. Throughout the 8 minutes and 30 seconds of gameplay, only 8 frame time spikes happened for a result of 0.94 spikes per minute. The processor drew typically around 51 watts and had an average temperature of 56 degrees Celsius. With lower settings, this might go much better, and for those with high refresh rate monitors, this might be a legitimate viable option. However, the resolution at 900p might not be that great for some people, so Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a DX11 game, is tested with Uletico's benchmark found on Steam's workshop. 1080p, medium to low settings, full screen. The benchmark tests for AI, large smoke effects, explosion, among other things. I ran this benchmark 5 times. Throughout all 5 runs, there is an average FPS of 73.7. There is a minimum and maximum of 6 FPS and 114 FPS respectively. 1% and 0.1% lows are the same at 6 FPS. There were only 3 frame spikes each run, only when smoke is involved. This gave a 1.8 spike per minute rating, and this only happens when smoke is involved. As per usual, this game is very heavily GPU bound, at 99% the entire time. The CPU, on the other hand, used a maximum of 55% usage. The processor has a temperature of 51 degrees Celsius and used up to 48 watts. By all standards, this is a really playable game, and reducing the quality might help it with high refresh rate monitors. The lack of sudden spikes means this game can be played competitively. Honkai Impact looks quite easy to run, but it definitely can be one of the more demanding titles. This game uses DX11 and is another one of the game that has a frame cap based on my monitor. The predecessor of Genshin Impact is tested with 2 use cases in mind. One is to play Honkai Impact as a competitive game. In that case, these are the settings. And this is tested 3 times in a fight against SS rank Helmaru with this team setup. This team setup has a lot of graphical effects and can easily slow down your PC. And it definitely helps me beat this boss faster. After fighting them 3 times, the benchmark returned an average FPS of 90 with a minimum and maximum of 27.7 and 122.7 respectively. There's a 1% low of 27 FPS and a 0.1% low of 12 FPS. This is largely attributed to when Phoenix uses her ultimate. There is a total of 9 spikes throughout the 1.5 minute run for a grand total of 6 spikes per minute. The CPU usage sat around or under 30% while the Vega 3 is sweating, trying to carry the entire game. The processor drew 46 watts of power and is at 49 degrees Celsius average. The spikes do not seem to go away, so if the spikes are a huge bother, this might not be very playable. The other use case is to play Honkai casually or leisurely, expecting better graphics quality. This is tested with these settings and running through a post-Honkai Odyssey once. A post-Honkai Odyssey is open world and has many effects with enemies. And this is where the processor is greatly kneecapped, like I took a bat and destroyed its kneecaps. The average frame rate set at 28, with a minimum 16 and a maximum of 40. Its 1% lows and 0.1% lows are 15 and 6 respectively. There were a total of 7 spikes throughout the 1 minute 20 second run through the map and fighting a few enemies. GPU usage is at 100% constantly, but the CPU is now hovering at around 15 to 20%. At least the power draw was at 44.4 watts, with a temperature of 49 degrees Celsius maximum. Overall, a very unenjoyable experience unless some settings were lowered. Considering the fact that Honkai Impact 3rd is also a very fighting-oriented game, this low frame rate means I do not recommend it. League of Legends was a game I decided to also benchmark while editing this video. This is a DX9 game that has seen plenty of use as a competitive title. My friend's brother helped me play the Garena version of the game through the first 2 tutorial levels. I only measured the second tutorial level. We couldn't find graphic settings and hence went with standard out-of-the-box settings. The game yielded an average of 89 FPS, 67 FPS minimum, 142 FPS maximum. There was a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 33. The game yielded 8 spikes throughout the 10-minute game, for a measurement of 0.8 spikes per minute. The CPU and GPU were equally stressed in this game, with both peaking at 100% at times, but do note that TeamViewer was running in the background, so it might consume some precious processing power. The processor consumed about 50 watts while staying cool at 55 degrees Celsius. From what my friend's brother says, he finds it fun and playable, save for a few lag spikes. Funnily enough, he has absolutely no idea that this computer has no graphics card. Valorant is a DX11 shooter and definitely requires priority on frame time and stutter rather than good quality. However, I decided to use these settings because the processor had much power to spare. 1080p and these settings. I tested the game by running through the training grounds as Jet, and then in a deathmatch. I ran this only once. Solid playable frame rates from Valorant in the training grounds with a 91 FPS average, 61 FPS minimum, and 124 FPS maximum. There is a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 47. There was a 1 spike in the 1-minute run. The processor had to work hard. The GPU was stuck at 100% while the CPU was peaking at 93%. It sipped up 52 watts and has a typical temperature of 53 degrees Celsius. As for the Valorant Deathmatch mode, competitive players can perform with this PC. The game ran with an average of 77 FPS, 44 FPS a minimum, and 99 FPS a maximum. Now that's 3 of a kind. There's a 1% low of 51 FPS and a 0.1% low of 31 FPS. 3 frame time spikes within the 7 minutes and 20 seconds gameplay before the system suddenly crashed because I didn't have enough voltage pumping through the RAM sticks. 0.4 spikes per minute measurement. Both processors were juggling between 80 and 90% usage and used around 52 watts. Temperatures are around 55 degrees Celsius. Playable? Yes. These frame rates are not anything I'd anticipate. Slightly lower graphical settings, maybe 900p, will make this game fluid. If only I didn't have this crummy mouse. Finally, to round up the gaming benchmarks, I ran Minecraft with Optifine G7 and tried to benchmark it in the only way I know how. Spawning a bunch of entities. These are my settings. My setup is to first load a super flat world with no entities except myself, then create a hole. In the hole I wired up 3 dispensers that contain creeper eggs, lingering potions, and fireworks. With a 2 redstone tick clock, I started spawning them en masse and watched the performance. Then I used the same hole and used this command, and then started spawning a ludicrous amount of creepers. Once I'm done, I watch the creepers while watching my frame counter. The first test netted 103 FPS on average with a 36 FPS on minimum and a 132 FPS on maximum. 1% low of 31 and a 0.1% low of 15. Unfortunately, the frame time graph looks like a stalagmite cave and gave me 9 spikes after a minute and 30 seconds, netting 6 spikes per minute. This OpenGL game danced on both CPU and GPU. The former hit 92% peak usage, while the latter hit 100% peak. The processor drew 46 watts of power and is at 49 degrees Celsius. The second test received a 28 FPS on average, with an 18 FPS minimum and a 35 FPS maximum. 1% and 0.1% lows are 13 and 9 respectively. At least the frame time graph was consistent, with 0 spikes per minute. This part seems to be heavily bottlenecked by the game itself, with the CPU usage peaking at 81%, and the Vega 3 peaking at 88% only after the creepers died. 45 watts was the typical draw, and a typical temperature of 55 degrees Celsius, excluding the peak 50 watts when the creepers died simultaneously. This wouldn't really happen, and considering these, Minecraft is a guaranteed playable game. Just to see how far I can take this PC, I decided to install Sonic Aether's Unbelievable Shaders Renewed, and then created a new world with an amplified world generation setting. In a surprise twist, it worked! While shader Minecraft is not anything you can reasonably play on, I wasn't able to get any information about it. It is running, except the game crashed 4 times to make it run. So yeah, that was kind of fun. Moving on to the synthetic benchmarks, I started with Time Spy and Firestrike Standard. Time Spy scored 717 points, with a graphics score of 641 and a CPU score of 2221. The GPU temperature peaked at 39 degrees Celsius. The CPU stress test peaked at 57 degrees Celsius. All clock speeds sustained under heavy load, no throttling. Firestrike Standard hit a score of 1980, 2160 on the graphics, and 6965 on the physics score. GPU temperature maxed out at 40 degrees Celsius and CPU was at 54 degrees Celsius. Then I ran Night Raid. It scored 7140 points with a graphics score of 8880 and a CPU score of 3384. The GPU temperature maxed out at 39 degrees Celsius while the CPU hit as high as 59 degrees Celsius. All these 3D Mark scores I ran only once and without demo. One run is enough to give a proper gauge of performance. Next I ran Cinebench R20 and R23 on single and multi-core. I ran each test thrice and averaged all results. Cinebench is a purely CPU load. R20 single core scored 389, while multi-core scored 976 on average. R23 single core scored 930 and multi-core scored 2492. I also ran Geekbench 5 once, netting a score of 983 on single and 2273 on multi. Next I ran CrystalDiskMark to test the storage. They scored fairly well for a cheap SSD, usable by a long shot. I moved on to a 30-minute LatencyMon marathon in order to test the background latency and they were looking good. Finally, I ran PCMark 10 demo twice to test the average results of this PC. It scored 3535 on average. To round this all up, I ran the stress test and here are the numbers. CPU voltage set to 1.3 volts and GPU voltage set to 1.175 volts. RAM is set to 2933 megatransfers per second and with the timings 16, 18, 18, 36 with 1.4 volts. The CPU temperature was reaching an average of 67.5 degrees Celsius with a maximum of 73.5 degrees Celsius. The graphics portion hit 53.3 degrees Celsius average with a maximum of 57.1 degrees Celsius. The processor drew an average of 64.4 watts and a maximum of 72.5 watts. VRM temperatures reported average of 63 degrees Celsius and a maximum of 65 degrees Celsius. Socket on chip temperatures reached 79 degrees Celsius on average, 85 degrees Celsius maximum. And that is all with the benchmark marathon. In general, for all the games above, they are playable if you make considerable concessions. They are good, not great, for entry level and budget level gaming, assuming that's where you're targeting. The best part is upgradability. You can add an extra graphics card or switch out the central processing unit for a different one and have a huge boost in performance. You could also switch out the RAM and use that, or the motherboard and then use that. Because of the upgradability of this PC, it's like when Bruce Lee gets weapon upgrades in Enter the Dragon. Okay, this project was sort of spontaneous as well as this conclusion. I don't really have anything to write as like a script for this because I really didn't know how to end this video. So the best I could do is say what I've really learned and give some of my own conclusions. First things first, this PC is around $300 to $400. For some people, it is definitely very expensive. Paying $300 to $400 US is it's a pretty big investment for some people relative to their own salaries, of course. Considering the fact that this PC could already run games very popular, Minecraft, Genshin Impact, things like Valorant, League of Legends, not sure who else still plays it, it already qualifies as like a replacement PC for some people. It could be used as an entertainment device, which is already great because that's what I set out to do. This PC was for people with like not enough money, and despite the fact that the YouTubers have already done something like this, I wanted to give it a bit more exposure. And I really love this. It's a passion project I had for a processor that I've really never known about until, well, a few months ago. The other thing I've learned is, despite the fact that there might be a lot of good hardware flying around and being overpriced, you don't really need much hardware to run the latest games, except that it's not going to be of great quality. You're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices so as to make it run. But it does at least play, and at least is playable. I think for a lot of people, good enough is good enough. You do not need something like ultra high quality settings at 1440p or at 4K to enjoy something like gaming, PC gaming for instance. And really, building this PC was a great joy as well. It really helped me therapeutically, and it also made me kind of reflect on how important it is sometimes to go in the other direction instead of having good hardware, to see what you could do, what you could do with limited hardware, to push it to its limits. Which leads me to another point: overclocking. Overclocking, a lot of people say is extremely risky. It might damage your devices, and now after I'm done with this, I have to concur. At first I thought overclocking was some sort of haha free boost. Why did Nvidia or Intel or AMD did not capitalize on this? Maybe they did. It's just that at that point you're risking lifespan, or you're damaging some components, or there might be some sort of insecurities or uncertainties that might result in your PC breaking down, your PC catching fire, or you catching fire, whichever one comes first. Also, regarding the PC as a whole, you don't really need to spend that much on an aftermarket cooler like what I did. You could still get away with a stock cooler because it's definitely under 65 watts. I'm not sure how well it sustained under something like the Prime95 Furmark stress test that I've brought up. It might crash, it might be too hot, so you might want to consider. It might not be necessary, but in case if the situation calls for it, get your own aftermarket cooler, and hopefully you could get it cheap. I got mine for about $30 US, around that much. It's not that expensive. And finally, I want to take this time to thank a few people, or a lot of people. All those YouTubers doing all those tech videos, thanks all of you. You really inspired me to make this video. This video was just more of a passion project than anything, so don't expect me to release videos every week or every day or every month or something like that. I'm probably just gonna release this once and never again. Also, I'd like to thank my parents for allowing me to get the budget to get the PC, as well as my friends for pushing me through and giving me game suggestions and listening out and helping me whenever possible, such as my friend's brother, who helped me play League of Legends, and I watched, and he was having real big amounts of fun. It's great. Here are my parting words. First of all, this PC, playable or nah? Definitely playable. Would play in a heartbeat, except I already have better hardware, so I'm not really sure where to go with this third PC. Secondly, if you have a dream, chase it. Do it. This is my first time making a video this large scale. It actually got me out of bed, and it took me 4 consecutive days doing everything from scratch, taking the video, building the entire PC, benchmarking, research, writing the script, recording the script, then putting it all together in Adobe Premiere. Yeah, just give it a shot. Done is better than perfect. I don't really need this video to be perfect. This is pretty much just a video to help people, and that's all there is to it for this video. Okay, thanks all of you for your time for watching this video. If you have any criticisms, feel free to leave it in the comments. Please be sure to be tactful about it, because I will not be able to listen to those that are very insulting. Thank you very much, and I will see you maybe next time, maybe never. Either way, again, thank you for watching.